The refueling station was on a small moon in the back end of nowhere, close to nothing but a couple of wormhole junctions. Since it had a little convenience store and everything, it really gave off 7 out of 11 next to a desert highway vibes. Just, in space. The moon wasn't too big enough for proper gravity or air on its own, so someone had installed a gravity generator under the dusty red ground and turned it up just a smidge too high, but I wasn't going to complain. I was going to buy pre-packaged alien snacks at the store while my coworkers handed the refueling. Mimi was calling the shots, tentacles waving and gravelly voice audible from here, while the Frillian twins handled the heavy lifting of connector hoses and Captain Sunlight was at the payment kiosk. The others were either staying on board or already browsing the aisles. ID just picked up a pack of something colorful, doing an artful fumble in recovery because of the gravity, when a rowdy group of armor lights trooped in. I didn't pay them too much attention, just a bunch of macho dinosaurs with holstered blasters and bipedal swagger. Totally normal here, but one of them said something that brought me up short. "Hey, look, another human," said the cheerful voice. "Maybe you can get some tips on how not to be such a disappointment." Raucous laughter followed. I frowned in their direction and saw that they did have a human with them, a pale and unassuming guy just a bit shorter and stockier than me. He looked annoyed by the comment, but not surprised. When he walked over to me, I asked, "What's that about?" The armor lights were already ignoring him. The guy sighed. They heard a lot of stories about humans before they hired me, and I don't meet their expectations. What kind of stories? Humans doing daring things, like running for hours to get medicine to dying people, catching a diseased rat before it infected an entire space station, throwing fruit at charging fauna hard enough to make it leave. He ticked things off on his fingers, exercising a ghost and riding a hover sled like a skateboard fast enough to catch a bomb before it blew up. How am I supposed to compete with that? He threw his hands in the air. I said, putting down the snack I was still holding. Would it make it better or worse to know those were all the same person? What? The rat wasn't actually diseased. The ghost was a howling dog, and I didn't know the thing was explosive when I rushed to catch it, I said. And I wasn't the only person throwing things at the fauna. What? He repeated, with a spread arms gesture that smacked into the shelf. Rubbing his hand, he asked, "That was all you?" "Yeah," I admitted. "Unless there are other humans doing the same things, which is possible." He raked fingers through his hair, setting it at odd angles. "I can believe this. I did tell them, but they'd just want to hire you instead." I rushed to assure him, "I've got a job already, and I don't want to take yours." Toughness was important. Kindness, not so much. "What do you do for them?" He sighed again. "Bookkeeping officially. They needed somebody to handle the boring stuff like money and permits while they focus on hunting the biggest animals they can sell." Gotcha. That sounds exciting. It's not. It's like going on a trip with my cousins again, except they were even bigger and make fun of me for not having claws. "You've got other stuff going for you, though," I said. "We just need to figure which of your differences they all respect most." "I am all ears," he said with a certain level of sarcasm. "Please tell me what about my fragile human physique will get me respect from the mighty." Oh, right, they did call themselves that. I'd almost forgotten. At least they were a straightforward species without a lot of mysterious depths. "Well," I said, thinking, "they like fighting. You're more suited to stealth than they are, small enough to hide and do sneak attacks that they wouldn't see coming. What if you introduced them to rubber band warfare and sniped from hidden parts of the ship?" "Nope," he said. "That would just end with me cornered somewhere, and them showing off how even thin scales are tougher than my skin." "Good point. Oh, what kind of animals do they hunt?" "You said big ones, but do you know the specific names?" I got out my phone and brought up the database of known fauna that I talked Captain Sunlight into buying for me. As her own hired animal expert, it was really the kind of thing that I should have. My vet training on Earth only went so far. I think the last one was a treehorn," he said. "Wait, they talked about going for Argoshan daggerbirds next, right? Now what kind of noises do those make?" I typed quickly. Big creatures indeed, by the looks of it. Daggerbirds had prevented more than one colony from getting a foothold in the wilds of a nearby world, and were unlikely to stop being a threat anytime soon. I skimmed the rundown for the vocal files. Here we go. Mating call. Keeping the sound low enough for just us to hear, I played the croaking warble. "Okay," the guy said, confused. "Can you imitate that?" I asked. "Give it a shot. Kinda like a frog." "Work." Looking skeptical, he did. The expression on his face said he wasn't impressed with his own efforts, but it sounded accurate enough to me. "Great," I said. "Give that a bit of practice, then you can go out with your crew and impress everybody by luring in some targets for them." "I could," he said thoughtfully. "I usually stay on the ship while they re-hunting, but it might be worth a try. Can I have a copy of that sound for practice? He got out his own phone and I played it again so he could record it. The armor lights were dumping things onto the front counter, ready to pay and leave. I caught sight of bright packaging that I recognized, and I had another idea. Thanks, the guy said. This might actually help. What was your name? Robin Bennett, I said with a belated handshake. Oscar Tennyson, he replied. Thanks for your help. Looks like I should grab my stuff and get going. Before you go, see those tall cans with the purple labels? I pointed at something the armor lights were buying. Yeah? Have you ever tried that? No! They get wasted on it. I've steered far clear. I grinned with all my teeth. That S not alcohol. That S caffeine. What? Humans can process caffeine better than most species on our own planet, and just about everybody in space. It is a poison to most. It gets them super drunk, but for you, I pointed at him with glee. For you, it's just a bit of energy. Pick your moment, then walk in casually while they re-getting wasted and slam one down. See what happens. He was smiling now. You are sure? It's really just caffeine? How much? I checked into it before. One of those huge cans is like a watered-down coffee. These guys are absolute lightweights, and they don't even know. He grinned to split his face. That is the best news. One of them called for him to hurry up, and he bid me a quick goodbye before scampering off. I saw him grab food cubes, water, and a six-pack of caffeine, which he bundled onto the counter as the armor lights headed out the door. Be right there! Just getting some stuff! They didn't look, simply telling him not to waste any time. He smiled his way through the purchase. Peeking over the shelves, I smiled too. Then I went back to my own purchases, with thoughts of getting an energy drink or two in his honor. Oscar Tennyson grabbed his purchases and hurried after the rest of his crew. As usual, they were walking quickly on their longer legs and bellowing for him to keep up. The teeth and scales Mighty had no patience for human weaknesses, of which there were many. But, as Oscar had just learned, there were some strengths as well, and he couldn't wait to show them. He scampered on board before the door shut, wondering if they would actually leave without him if he dawdled too long. Probably not who would handle their finances and hunting permits. They'd have to hire someone else, because they certainly didn't want to do it themselves. But he didn't want to test that. He had much better things to test. While the stark metal walls vibrated with the engine's revs, Oscar wove between scaled biceps and tails to his own quarters. He pressed the panel by the door, which was oversized and cracked like all of them on this ship. The Mighty were not fans of fiddly little buttons or keys, not when they could have panels big enough to punch, which only broke sometimes. When Oscar stepped through and closed the door behind him, he felt immediately relieved. This was his private space to decorate as he chose, without worrying that someone would take things down or make fun of him. Ship rules were clear about personal quarters. Oscar's fake orchids and real cactus made the room homey, along with more posters than the walls could hold. They spilled onto the ceiling, lining it with nature scenes from Earth, sports figures he admired, media announcements, and a good number of fluffy kittens. This was the one spot on the ship where he could feel comfortable, and he was making the most of it. The bag of refueling station supplies crinkled as he set it on his small table to remove the contents. A high-end store might have had water wheel bags that evaporated after a day, but this place used regular old plastic. Inside were food cubes, bottled water, and the purchase he was most excited about: 6 cans of very weak caffeine. He scanned the label. It was just like the other human had said. Tall cans in dramatic colors, but not much of substance inside. At least, not as far as the average human was concerned. Oscar couldn't wait until dinner time. Before then, he had a permit to submit and several other things to check. The ship should be on the way to Arosa, which was notorious for welcoming outsiders in to hunt the dagger birds that were giving everyone so much trouble, but he had better get their paperwork in order anyway. He grabbed his tablet and left his safe haven, heading back into the public parts of the ship where he could face taunts from any direction. Really, these guys were just like his cousins. At least it was familiar, fending off tiresome conversation. How's the weather down there? Why don't you ask your mother? He reached the bridge and found a corner to stand in. The captain and the pilot were arguing about where to land when they reached Arosa. The main site will have more people to admire our ship. The new one is closer to the hunting grounds. Daggerbirds are overrunning the place. Everywhere is a hunting ground. Do you want to pay the damages for shooting a building instead of a bird? We can take it all out of your pay if you want. Fine, but if we land on some overgrown hedge and the ship is scratched, you get to pay for that. Fine! The pair of them stopped yelling and sat back in their seats as if nothing at all was the matter because it wasn't tea. Polite disagreements were always held at that volume. In the brief lull while the pilot manipulated the controls with more force than a lesser console could withstand, Oscar spoke up. I'd like to come too. Both dinosaurian heads turned to stare at him in surprise. Why? The captain demanded. One kick from a bird, and you were useless to us. Thanks, Oscar said flatly. I'll keep out of the way. I want to take photos of your fighting prowess. I should be able to sell them. Both of the mighty preened at that, as he'd known they would. Ego was big here. The captain agreed, and Oscar didn't let slip any hints of his secret plan. He just finished working on his tablet, then retreated to his quarters to practice daggerbird mating calls. The air on Argosia was breathable but hot, at least this part of it. Oscar was ready with his tool in his pocket. He'd gotten out of the habit of calling it a phone since the mighty were right in that it did a near infinite number of things. He still smirked quietly at the potential innuendo, but it was a conversation he didn't really want to have with giant dinosaur aliens, so he kept that to himself. This way, announced the captain, pointing in what looked like an arbitrary direction into the wilderness. Whooping with the alien equivalent of testosterone, the crew raised their blasters and tromped off the landing pad with Oscar following close behind. True to his word, he did take some pictures as he went, but he was waiting for his moment. It didn't take long to come. The shouting scared off all the wildlife. Then the mighty found a boulder to crouch behind and wait for the creatures to come back. They played a silent counting game to see who was best at guessing when they spot something worth killing. Distant footsteps on leaves made them smack each other in excitement, but nothing appeared between the trees. Now or never, Oscar thought. Knowing better than to startle his crewmates, he whispered, "Here, let me." Then he took a deep breath and let loose with his best imitation of a daggerbird seeking a mate. Work! While the mighty shushed him and wondered what he was doing and started to figure it out, an answering work sounded from nearby. Then another. Then 3. Oscar wondered if he overplayed his hand. No less than 5 large and eager daggerbirds crashed through the undergrowth at once, croaking and flapping, taking offense at each other's presence. The mighty all roared and leapt out, firing in every direction. Oscar dashed for a tree he'd been eyeing, the one with lots of branches, and didn't stop climbing until he was out of beak-stabbing range. He held tight to the trunk, catching his breath and watching the chaos. Belatedly, he remembered to take out his tool and snap some photos. This was actually a good angle. He got a great shot of the captain, aiming down the throat of a wide-open beak, then another a split second later when the beak snapped shut inches from his head. Another of the engineer shooting one from beneath. 2 of the pilot tackling the largest bird and sinking teeth into the back of its neck where it couldn't reach to stab. Other species did their trophy hunting from a distance. The mighty liked the fight as much as the kill. Their blasters were set on a deliberately low setting, and their teeth were sharp. Safe up in his tree, Oscar grimaced at how bloody things were getting down below. He yelled another bird call to distract the one about to spear the crewmate who'd been knocked to the ground, and he got a cheerful nice save by the little guy, which was as close to a thank you as he was going to get. The crewmate scrambled up and bit off a chunk while the bird was distracted. A couple of the crew looked like they were bleeding their own blood, but most of it was coming from the dagger birds, which were just as stubborn as the stories had said. Not one of them ran off. The last to die fell on top of somebody, which just added laughter from the rest of the crew to the triumphant cheers. Oscar took a picture of the bird being dragged off his disgraced crewmate. That photo he wouldn't sell but would keep as minor blackmail if he ever needed it. Sticking it up on the wall to remind everyone of this moment could be a valuable strategic move. "We are the mighty," bellowed the captain, and the whole crew joined in with a deep-voiced cheer. Oscar climbed down to more approval than he'd gotten in the last month. "Good work by our human here. Who knew you could do that? That's sure an efficient way to hunt. We should bring you out every time." That was great. Oscar took the praise with pride, not bothering with modesty. That was just another word for weakness, as far as these guys were concerned. He managed to dodge when one of them made to slap him on the back with a large blood-stained hand, which just made them laugh more. Luckily, the captain directed everybody to gather their kills for dragging back to the ship, rather than chasing the human and messing up his clothes. Oscar took a position on the lowest branch of his tree, taking a couple more photos as the victorious hunters figured out how to get it all home. If anyone had asked Oscar, which they never would, he'd have suggested going back for a hover cart or taking them one at a time. But of course they didn't either. Definitely the type to insist on carrying all the groceries in at once, Oscar thought, as his crewmates strained to drag the giant carcasses through the undergrowth. He hopped down and kept pace out to the side where there was no blood on the leaves. They finally made it back to the ship, doing nothing to clean up the smears of blood they left on the landing pad. Oscar darted off to his quarters as soon as the door opened. The rest of them could handle getting the birds into cryo-storage or chopped up right away, whichever they saw fit to do. The lowest-ranking one without significant injuries would be in charge of clearing the blood from the hallways, but only after they'd all taken a walk through the water and air blast chamber that passed for a shower here. It had always reminded Oscar of a car wash. He kept to himself until dinner, sorting his photos while everyone else dealt with the catch and the mess and the injuries. The mechanical med system on this ship was just as efficient as the shower. They'd all be in decent shape by mealtime, and mealtime after a successful hunt was also drinking time. Oscar usually ate in his room, wanting nothing to do with the raucous meat tearing and drunkenness. But today was different, because he learned something valuable about the liquid they were getting drunk off. Oscar considered the cans he bought, then decided it would have more of an impact if he just took one of the communal supply. So instead, he grabbed his new food cubes and a pre-made tin of spaghetti from his mini cryo and followed the sound of laughter. They were already a little drunk when he got there, sprawled across chairs with a table full of meat slabs spilling over the edges of the plates. And as expected, there were tall, purple cans everywhere. "Hey, it's the little guy! Let S hear it for the human with the surprise talent. Maybe you're not useless after all." "Thanks," Oscar said as they pounded fists against anything in reach as a form of applause. He leaned against the open doorway and shuffled his belongings so he could get a fork and a meatball without setting down the food cubes. "That was pretty easy where I am from. You guys really can't do that?" He popped the meatball into his mouth, casual as you please. The mighty, of course, thought this was funny and took it in stride. More gulps from their drinks, more savage mouthfuls of food, and a few questions about the surely excellent photos he'd gotten, which would make them all look amazing. Oscar said he'd share the best ones. These would make fine decorations in their own quarters and would probably be appreciated by the right-paying audience. Then came the moment he'd been waiting for. The captain raised his drink in another cheer, and somebody noticed that the human was the only one without a can in his hand. "Get the human a Warrior S drink. Bet you he passes out after one sip." "Nah, he can take at least two." Oscar smiled quietly. If they'd been paying attention, they might have changed their bets at that smile. He set his food down in the hallway to free his hands. When one muscular, taloned arm offered him a can of their most potent intoxicant, he took it. Oh, so casually. Then he whipped his head back and chugged the whole thing. "Oh, human S gonna die! I'm not cleaning up the puke. What the supernova? There are better ways to go than that. Somebody drag him to medical so we don't have to find somebody else to do the boring stuff." Yeah, he was just getting interesting. Oscar ignored all of them, giving the empty can a thoughtful look. It felt like the same thin aluminum he remembered from Earth. And if there was anything his cousins had taught him, it was the proper way to dispose of a beer can. He dug his fingertips in and crushed it against his forehead. Then, while the room reacted to that, he wiped off the drips and threw the can across the room. When it went into the trash on the first try, he was internally very glad, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he picked up his food and resumed eating. "What's the big deal?" he said. "Is that what you guys have been getting drunk off? How quaint. How in all the black holes know? He is gonna fall over any second, just watch." Quaint. That S hilarious. He is totally bluffing. Just wait and see. Oscar was enjoying being the center of the crew's attention today. He made a show of sweeping his eyes across the various cans in the room. "None of you has finished a can yet, I see. Was that supposed to be strong?" There was widespread laughing and elbowing of each other, most of them still clearly convinced that the silly little human was going to throw up and die any second now. So Oscar set down his food, walked over to the table, and chugged a second one. It was a bit more liquid than his stomach was really happy with, but that was a small price to pay for the uproar that followed. They exclaimed. They renewed their bets. They drank from their own cans. They got visibly drunker and abandoned their bets. Oscar leaned against the doorframe, eating spaghetti and food cubes. After one particularly unsteady crewmate tripped onto the table full of meat, and someone pointed out that the human wasn't wobbling at all, Oscar said, "You guys don't know much about my species, do you? Half of what I eat would liquefy your insides." He held up a food cube, eyeing the different colored specks of all the ingredients that made it balanced for an omnivorous digestive system. He laughed. "You guys just eat meat. How boring." They only got drunker after that. Oscar was pretty sure that the nearest two wanted to pat him on the back, but the floor was moving too much for them to make it all the way to the doorway. Somebody offered him a raw slab of daggerbird. He turned it down with casual scorn. "Nah, meat isn't worth eating unless it's passed through fire. That S-weakling meat you've got there. Get back to me when it's cooked brown." They loved that. The party was an epic one, only winding down when most of the crew was too drunk to reach more drinks. Oscar demonstrated his steadiness by picking through the mess to drop his food containers in the trash, then move back to the door. "Well, it's been fun," he said. "I'll send in the med drone to make sure nobody's going to wake up dead. Let me know if you want to get your tails handed to you by any more daggerbirds." I'll call him in close for you again. He got groggy approval to that. Oscar left with a smile on his face and a mild amount of caffeine in his blood. Maybe after stopping by the med center, he de-used that energy on some exercise. Thoughts of the run to the hunting grounds and the way his crewmates had paced themselves suggested that it wouldn't take much practice for him to out-endurance the mighty on the VR treadmill. I wonder what else I can do.